Good morning, good evening, good whatever it is, wherever you are, and welcome to this virtual event that is co-hosted by the Brookings Institution and our neighbors, at least in the physical world, the American Enterprise Institute, on the question of the earned income tax credit and whether the recent changes that have been made to expand that credit should be left in place. If you've been paying attention, you'll have noticed there have been some pretty big changes in tax credits and in welfare generally in the US following the change in administration and control of Congress, some with bipartisan support. The real question, I think, is whether these temporary measures that have been introduced is whether they'll remain permanent, and if so, which and why. And today's session does focus just on the one of those changes, which is to the earned income tax credit, or the changes that have been made to the EITC, including broadening the eligible age range for the credit down from 25 to 19 and taking the age cap at the top away altogether, as well as increasing the salary cap and amount for workers without children. So as I said, the question before us is, should we keep these changes for good or not? We have a very, very packed and exciting schedule in front of us. First, you're going to hear from Senator Michael Bennet, Senator from Colorado, who's been a real leader on tax reform and welfare reform generally. And then after those brief remarks, the Senator has agreed to a light grilling from our friend and scholar from AEI, Angela Rashidi. And then there'll be a conversation between myself and Javier Martinez, who is a representative from New Mexico, who've just recently expanded their own state EITC. Following that, there is a panel that can only be described as a galaxy of gurus on this question, moderated by my colleague Belle Sawhill. And then last but not least, we have speaker Paul Ryan to close out our event. So we're going to be covering some of the politics and the policy and the details at both federal and state level. So again, thank you for joining us. Watch this space. And with that, I'll hand over to, with a huge welcome, to the virtual Brookings stage to Senator Bennet and then to Angela.
Thank you, Richard. I always ask, can you hear me?
Yeah,
so
coming through loud and clear.
I've learned that a year of Zoom is
Yeah.
start by saying.
Better to ask.
Well, it's wonderful to see you again, and I want to thank Brookings and the other panelists for everything. When I leave, I really got to leave because I have an airplane to catch back to Colorado, so I apologize for running out on a topic that I care a lot about. I care a lot about it because before I was in the Senate, I was the superintendent of the Denver Public Schools, having spent time in business and government before that. And what I knew about the parents in the Denver Public Schools was most of their kids were kids of color. Most of their kids were kids living in poverty. A lot of their parents were working 2 and 3 jobs, and no matter what they did, they couldn't get their children out of poverty. And now I've been in the Senate for 11 years and traveled the state of Colorado broadly, one of the most dynamic economies in America. And if I had to summarize those town halls, it's very easy to do. It's people coming and saying, Michael, we're working really hard, but no matter what we do, we can't afford some combination of housing, healthcare, higher education, early childhood education, even assuming it's available, childcare, even assuming it's available. We can't save anything. We feel like our kids are going to live a more diminished life than the life we live, and we already feel like we're living a more diminished life than our parents lived. And what I'm reporting to you is, I think, a very honest anecdotal reflection of an economy that for 50 years has worked really well for the top 10% of Americans, as Richard Reeves captures this in a book of his that I once read and we once discussed, and has not worked for 90% of the American people. And I believe strongly that it's a threat to our democracy. We've got some of the lowest rates of economic mobility and economic security in the industrialized world. Too many young Americans enter the labor market in low-paying, low-opportunity jobs and really struggle to climb up from there. That disproportionately affects young workers of color. And decades later, some are still working low-paid jobs into their golden years because they never had a chance to build economic security. And I can't think of anything more at war with the American dream than someone working full-time their entire life, but never being in a position to retire and unable to leave something behind for their kids. But that's the economy we have for millions of Americans. I would say even most Americans. There's so many things we need to do that builds an economy that works for everyone. Because in the ideal world, what we need is an economy that when it grows for everybody, not just the people at the very top, and no longer acts as a recession for middle class people and working people when we see GDP growth. But I think in the meantime, one of the most important steps is expanding the earned income tax credit for low income workers without kids. And that's why along with the child, we actually had two bills. One was Bennett Brown and the other one is Brown Bennett. Bennett Brown was the expansion of the child tax credit, which I know is not the subject for today, but that also has passed as part of this. The American Rescue Plan will cut childhood poverty almost in half this year by, among other things, making that credit fully refundable for the first time. But the other bill was Brown Bennett, which was the ITC bill, which we wrote several years ago to dramatically expand the earned income tax credit, including for workers without children, and which we fought, as I said, to have in the president's rescue plan. The president's plan tripled the credit as our proposal did, from roughly $500 to $1,500 per year for workers without children. Believe it or not, until now, Washington was actually taxing these workers into or deeper into poverty. Now with the expanded credit, that's not going to happen, at least for a year. And as Richard mentioned, at the same time, we lowered eligibility for the credit from age 25 to 19 so that young workers who are just getting their foot in the labor market can start to build economic security. We also eliminated the age limit for eligibility to benefit older workers who are still on the job. Those changes are going to help 17 million workers in this country, including 300,000 workers in Colorado. It's going to give them an extra cushion to cover expenses like rent and groceries and utilities, and maybe give them a little bit to put aside for retirement. And another way to think about that is we're giving people a margin for error, so they aren't one emergency expense away from going over the edge. And I've become very interested in the literature that suggests that when you've got efforts like the expansion to the EITC and the child tax credit, you actually see higher workforce participation rates rather than lower ones. My anecdotal understanding of this from Colorado is that will absolutely be the case, as people find it easier to hold on to jobs because they've got some incremental cash flow to deal with unexpected expenses or things like childcare. So I'm very hopeful that we're going to be able to extend the expanded EITC beyond 1 year. This has historically been a bipartisan idea because it reflects the common sense notion that our tax system should reward work and it should help people build economic security, not push them deeper into poverty. And in my view, this is exactly the kind of legislation that could start to bind our country together and earn the confidence of the American people by responding to their needs. We have an incredible opportunity in front of us to strengthen our democracy and build an economy that works for everyone. And it's our job to seize that opportunity and finally make the investments in working people that we've put off for too long. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to take anybody's questions or criticisms or ideas.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Bennet. Well, thank you for being here and for your remarks. It's really a pleasure to join you this afternoon for this discussion. I am going to jump right in with some follow-up questions, if that's okay with you. Then I want to maybe touch on a couple just more controversial maybe aspects of your proposal. I think just first, kind of from a broad perspective, and you touched on this a little bit in your opening remarks, but I mean, I study poverty and I'm particularly interested in child poverty and how to reduce child poverty. So what we're talking about today is an expansion of the childless EITC. So this is the earned income tax credit for people without dependent children. So I'm just curious from your perspective, kind of how do you see the childless EITC kind of fitting into a broader anti-poverty agenda? And are you concerned at all that it might actually distract from policies and efforts that might be more targeted towards reducing child poverty?
My view on child poverty is that it is an absolute embarrassment that we have among the highest childhood poverty rates in the country, and that the population that is poorest in our country is children. It is, I mean, an embarrassment. It's a travesty. And I think expanding the EITC for struggling childless workers actually is a key pillar for our fight against poverty, including child poverty. First, there are a lot of childless workers who do have children. Many are parents who are supporting non-custodial children, and others are non-parental caregivers who are supporting children. So even if they're not eligible to claim those kids on the tax return, the increase to the childless EITC will help them. Second, many beneficiaries of the expanded EITC, such as young, low-paid workers just starting out in the labor market, well, those are tomorrow's parents, and giving those workers the chance to build financial security today will ensure our next generation of children grows up in more financially secure homes. And I'd say finally that I mentioned earlier, this expansion to the EITC passed as a pair of bills. The other one was a dramatic increase to the child tax credit that I wrote in 2015 that's going to cut childhood poverty in America almost in half. And interestingly, 90% of America's children are going to benefit from the changes we made to the child tax credit. So when you take those things together, I think they're both essential elements of reducing childhood poverty in the country. They're not sufficient, but I think they're quite a good start.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. Kind of staying on this theme of children. So research is pretty clear that children do better in terms of child outcomes when they're in a two-parent married household. And it's also fairly well known that the earned income tax credit penalizes marriage in the sense that parents can get a few extra $1,000s in the earned income tax credit if they remain unmarried, but if they marry, sometimes they can lose that earned income tax credit. So we generally think of it as penalizing marriage. So the expanding the childless EITC actually would make that problem worse. So I guess my question for you is kind of, what are your views on the marriage penalty? Are you concerned about the marriage penalty? And are there things from a policy perspective that you might do to address that marriage penalty?
Well, I know you know better than I do, Angela, that it's incredibly challenging to design a tax system that achieves marriage neutrality, and relieving marriage penalties entails trade-offs, of course. But I'm not aware of any evidence that taxes have much effect at all on people's decisions to marry. What the evidence does show is that many young people today want to be financially secure before they marry and start a family. And the extra income from the expanded EITC for younger workers is going to help improve their economic security, and I think put them in a better position to make those life decisions. So I'm open to your ideas and others to further strengthening the ITC, including in ways that may relieve marriage penalties. But I think it's essential to make these historic expansions permanent.
Great. So the other issue that kind of always comes up when we talk about the earned income tax credit is program integrity. And by that, I mean kind of making sure that the program is free from errors and that funds being used for it are being spent properly. So another well-known problem with the earned income tax credit is it has relatively high rates of what we call improper payments. And I think the most recent rate is about $1 of every $4 paid out from the IRS, and the earned income tax credit is improper. And some of that, as you probably know, is due to just mistakes that families make because it's a fairly complicated tax credit. Right. But kind of putting aside concerns about tax compliance among higher income households, which is also a concern, but are you concerned that the expansion that we're talking about with the childless EITC is going to make that problem with improper payments even worse? And I'm mostly thinking about kind of this interaction with expanding the age down. So it's going to cover young adults who might be in school, and then having added also the full-time student exclusion, I believe, which maybe you can explain that a little bit. But I guess just broadly, are you concerned at all about kind of program integrity?
Well, first of all, the broader question here, Angela, I think is that you call our attention to is incredibly important. We now have the IRS commissioner saying the number is $1 trillion. That ought to create, in terms of a lack of compliance, not for the EITC, but for everything. And I hope that that's going to lead to bipartisan efforts in the Congress and with the administration to collect those taxes, because we certainly need to put them to work. And while you're totally right that we should make efforts to further reduce overpayments to the EITC program, I also think discussions of overpayments often miss several important points. First, IRS studies show what you just said, and that is that the majority of EIT errors are unintentional. They're driven by the complexity of the EITC's rules and the complexity of many family arrangements. In other words, they're mistakes. They're not fraud. Second, overpayment estimates are based on the 2015 audit data, and that means they miss recent action by Congress and the IRS to reduce overpayments and improve program integrity for the EITC. As an example, starting in tax year 2017, the IRS improved its matching process for earnings statements, and the IRS also increased its penalty on paid tax preparers who engage in willful or reckless conduct. And I think we need to continue to look at those kinds of things. And finally, returns filed by paid tax preparers account for the majority of EITC overpayments. In other words, it's often paid preparers, not individual taxpayers, who are responsible for erroneous claims. And Congress has simply failed to give the IRS the authority to regulate paid preparers, despite recommendations from GAO and others. And I think we should start by passing a bipartisan bill to regulate paid preparers, like the one written by my colleagues, Senators Rob Portman and Ben Cardin. But ultimately, while I believe strongly that we should work to reduce the overpayment rate, I don't believe that should stop us from boosting incomes for our nation's struggling workers.
And can you just explain, because I guess part of my concern around the improper payments was kind of the lowering the age to cover maybe more students, or it would be maybe less well targeted. But can you just explain the thinking behind both lowering the age and increasing the age at the top end?
Yeah, I mean, it lowering the age is to be able to get people going sooner on with a higher income, on the theory that that'll put them on a better trajectory for the rest of their lives, which is true, and give them the flexibility. I mean, if you talk to anybody, a young worker in this country, they don't have a whole lot of hope that the American dream is still available to them. And I want to see their workforce participation rate increase too. I think this will help do that. And again, begin to build lifetime earnings earlier, which is going to help everybody. The flip side of it is people aren't able to retire the way they were historically. And I think that lifting the cap is an appropriate way of recognizing that there are a lot of people on the other end who want to keep working, ought to have the benefit of the credit.
Okay, great. That makes sense. So I feel like I need to ask this question, and it kind of is related to how various policy proposals that have come from the Democrats kind of interact and where the prioritization comes. So I'm thinking about the minimum wage. So there have been proposals from the Democrats in Congress to increase the minimum wage to $15. And I think just some calculations, if there was a national $15 an hour minimum wage and somebody worked full time, that would put them out of the income eligibility range for the childless EITC. So I'm just kind of curious your thinking behind the childless EITC expansion, the minimum wage. Do we need both? Do you see one? If we have one, do we maybe not need the other? Just kind of what's your thinking around those two policies?
So one thing I want to say is that I'm not for every single Democratic policy proposal that's made in this space. And I ran a virtually unnoticed, lonely campaign for president on the idea that we could cut childhood poverty in half by making this change to child tax credit. And I'm really glad that we're doing that. I think it's the right thing to do. I think it's essential for us to do it and to increase the EITC at the same time. And my answer on the minimum wage is yes, workers need both. And the minimum wage hasn't been increased in more than a decade. By 2025, there won't literally, that's just 4 years from now, there won't be a single county in the United States where a worker can afford to live on less than $15 an hour. And research shows that a higher minimum wage with a stronger EITC, that they're complements, not substitutes. Low-paid workers need a strong wage floor so their EITC isn't captured by their employer's ability to pay them lower wages. And my colleague Sherrod Brown and I believe that struggling workers should be eligible for the EITC at higher earnings than under previous law, which is, as you say, why our bill also increased the maximum earnings thresholds. And the President's American Rescue Plan followed that, increasing the earnings threshold for childless workers from about $16,000 to $21,000 a year. And while some workers in the highest minimum wage states may earn too much to be eligible, as you said, others will remain eligible because they aren't going to get enough hours at their job, or they might go through a spell of unemployment. And fortunately, part of the EITC's bipartisan appeal is that it's a pretty well-designed program. Benefits phase out gradually as workers earn more, so workers will always be better off with a higher wage when they receive one, including from a minimum wage increase. So that was the logic.
Okay, great. Yeah, I can see how that works. Yeah, it definitely would then, if the $15 an hour minimum wage became the federal minimum wage, it certainly would kind of shift the composition of who would benefit then from the EITC. Like you said, it would go much more to part-time workers or workers who don't work full-time.
Right.
So there were a couple of audience questions.
Yeah.
Yep.
I was just going to say, by the way, I think, and in so doing, probably better reflects the complexity of the workforce that we have. Anyway, I hope that they'll work well together.
Yep. So there were a couple questions that came in from audience members who had registered, and one I thought was pretty interesting given what's happening on the child tax credit side. But the question was around the advanced payments. And so the EITC is still offered as a lump sum payment at tax time. So has there been any thought given to making the EITC more of a periodic payment that comes either monthly or quarterly?
Yeah, I certainly would be very interested in doing that. We've got a look. We've been on the child tax credit. We say periodic in the law. What we're intending is for that to be monthly. And when I survey people at home and ask them what would make the biggest difference, every now and then somebody says, "Well, I'd like to still get it in one lump sum." But people actually, would like to have it when their rent is due, and and when their other bills are due, and that's probably true for the EITC too. So for years and years and years, the pushback on this was the IRS can't possibly administer such a program. They can't do it. It won't work. And we've been very clear, both the House and the Senate, that we want this to be done as periodic payments. Monthly payments is what we've said to them. The Secretary of the Treasury has committed to get that done. The head of the IRS is now committed to get it done by July. So I'm optimistic that we're going to be able to, I'm sure there will be mistakes along the way, but that we'll have the structure in place. And then hopefully we could turn to the EITC and have a similar arrangement.
Great. Well, that's something we certainly can agree on. I've always been a big proponent of trying to figure out how to make that tax credit offered to families and individuals on a more regular basis. One other question that came in from the audience, and if you could speak to this, is kind of this idea of the increased labor force participation, which is one goal of this policy, but just your thoughts on kind of how that fits into broader strategies to try to increase labor force participation, particularly among men, as like my colleague at AEI, Nick Eberstadt, has written extensively about. We do have a declining labor force participation among prime age men. Just like, so if this is a piece of that, do you see it as a piece of a larger picture, and what would that be? Or just kind of how does it fit into your thinking around that broader issue?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, first of all, I sort of think of this the same way. I mean, I know there are a lot of people on this call that know a lot more about this than I do, but to me, it is utterly unacceptable that we've got the among the lowest economic mobility rates of any country in the industrialized world, and one of the highest childhood poverty rates. I mean, I don't believe we can accept that as a permanent feature of our economy, either of those things. We can't, and as I said earlier, ideally what we would want is an economy that when it grew, everybody benefited, which it's been a long time since that's been true. And that's really demoralizing. And I think it's terribly destabilizing for a democracy. And I think it's the fundamental reason why our labor force participation rates are as low as they are. And we should not accept that as a fundamental aspect of our economy, which is, I'm sure, why all of you guys are doing the work that you're doing, because you want to get that figured out too. And I think it just makes sense that, if you can make work pay enough to be rewarding, that will have the effect of improving our workforce participation rates. And if people can have just a little bit of help with their expenses in the time when they need it most, to pay for a car repair that they otherwise, would prevent them from going to work, or to pay for some childcare so that they could stay on a job. We saw that in the pandemic, in spades. If we can do that, I think it just makes logical sense that people are going to want to work. And I think people do want to work. They just don't earn enough in America to stay at work, because we have made it so difficult to be poor and to work. So we should be thinking about strategies beyond this that, I think, for example, paid family leave is something that is a pro-work policy, in my view, that ought to be part of what we do for the same reason. Because if people have a rational and reasonable expectation that they're going to be able to take leave if they need to take care of a loved one, and that the job will be waiting for them on the other end, that's going to do good things for workforce participation rates, not bad things.
Great. And it is true. All these policies kind of all interact and
Right.
all focused on the same thing. So in our last minute or so, and thank you again for your time and being so willing to answer all of my questions, but kind of crystal ball here. So what really do you think are the prospects of this, and even some of the other tax provisions in the American Rescue Plan, of becoming permanent?
We are, I believe very strongly that obviously we should make both the ITC changes permanent and the child tax credit permanent. And I think the spirit in the White House wants to do it. Whether in the end they're going to be able to do it, I don't know. I think at a minimum, we're going to get a very substantial, extension, and the full refundability, I think, is certainly going to become permanent. Which is that's a major policy advance in my view, since the poorest families and the poorest kids haven't been able to benefit from the tax credit, and that's where the biggest difference will be made. But I think this is a once in a lifetime opportunity for us to say again, we're not going to accept these kind of poverty rates in the country, and if we don't have to, and that these are pro-work policies that we have designed very intentionally with that in mind, and that therefore we should make them permanent. If we don't at this point, I'm quite confident that we will in the future. I mean, I think there's bipartisan support. My friend Mitt Romney introduced the first, he and I wrote the first bill that a Republican signed on to that created full refundability for the child tax credit. And He obviously has now written his own version of that. There's very strong interest in the earned income tax credit on their side as well. So I think one way or another, we're going to, we imagine an America where we're doing something about childhood poverty, and we're doing something about economic mobility as part, as you say, of a bigger approach. Because what we've learned essentially since China entered the WTO is that what we've been doing all these years actually isn't working very well for the American worker and for American families. And I think it's time for us to put aside the playbooks from 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years ago and figure out what the playbook needs to look like in the 21st century. These two tax credit advances, I think, are a part of that vision.
Well, I think I will leave it there. Senator Michael Bennet, thank you again so much for your time.
For your interest, and Angela, thank you for your questions. And I'm now going to go to Colorado. Please give my best.
Well, enjoy your trip. Thanks again. And Richard Reeves, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you so much for that, Angela, and Senator Bennet, I think now running to the airport. As I was listening to Senator Bennet, I realized that we had the other senator from Colorado on a Brookings panel recently talking about apprenticeships. So that both very clear policy thinkers. I don't know, it must be something about the mountain air or maybe the marijuana, but it's no coincidence maybe. But now we're going to switch our attention to New Mexico. I'm delighted to welcome Javier Martinez. He represents the 11th district in the House of Representatives in New Mexico. He's also a community organizer, social activist. I hope you'll accept that term, Javier. He actually runs a very important non-profit in New Mexico. And so whilst he sits on boring sounding groups like the Housing and Taxation Committee, he also is working kind of actively in the community. And Javier, welcome and thank you. One of the reasons we're so pleased to have you is because New Mexico has very recently introduced its own expanded earned income tax credit at the state level. And as Senator Bennet was just saying, these systems all interact with each other. So I think it's important to think about federal and state. So for those people who don't necessarily know about this, how does a state EITC interact with the federal EITC without undermining it in some way? Can you just talk a bit about how they fit together? And then I want to hear a bit, and then we'll get into kind of how it happened and why it matters so much to you.
Yeah, thank you, Richard, and thank you for your team for inviting me. It's quite an honor to share the Zoom screen with all of you. Back in 2007, 2008, New Mexico passed the Working Families Tax Credit, which is what we call our credit. And the way it interacts with the federal in a very simple way, you take a percentage of what the family receives from the federal, and that's what they receive in addition here at the state level. So in its original version, it was 10% of the EITC. In 2019, we increased that to 17%. Don't ask me how we got to 17%. It's how the sausage making happens in the legislature. That was the compromise. But this last session, we actually increased that to 25%. So now families who receive the EITC will get an additional 25% of that through the state.
Right. So it's effectively a kind of top up to a top up, right? So you get the
right.
you get it, and then you add to that without in any way diminishing it. So it stacks one on top of the other. And obviously there are other states that are doing this too, and you've just expanded it. So one of the things that you've done also at the same time is to similarly to the temporary changes at the federal level to expand downwards in terms of age,
right.
and improve young adults in that too. I'd just like to hear a little bit about how did that come to be a priority for you? Because I think it'd be fair to say you've led the kind of charge on this. And what impact do you think that might have on the communities that you've worked with?
Sure. Well, a lot of the work to expand the Working Families Tax Credit upward in terms of the percentage, but also as to who could get it, comes from the community. There's a very strong community of foster youth who have aged out of the foster care system, who are very active in state policy making. And it was actually them who brought the idea a few years ago. We've attempted a few times without success in the past until this year, but now we finally are able to expand that credit downwards, as you say, to young workers without children ages 18 to 25, so that they too can access the credit. And that's extremely important because New Mexico has a pretty high, relatively speaking, a high number of young people in foster care. And so as they're aging out, many times they don't have the support of their families, those first few years when they're out in the workforce. So it's important for them to be able to access this as a poverty alleviation measure. The other group that we've expanded it to as well are workers who are undocumented and file their taxes with a tax ID number as opposed to a social security number. I believe we're only the second or third state to extend the credit to those families.
Right, and that's obviously bringing in a whole different group of people as well who otherwise wouldn't be able to be helped. But I want to come back to this young worker piece. I wasn't aware of the involvement of a particular group, those who've kind of aged out of foster care. And even if you have relatively high numbers by national standards, that it can still only be a relatively small percentage of the labor force. And so was that really, talk a bit about the politics of that, I guess. Was it really just because it highlighted the struggles that many young adults do have getting onto the labor market and earning a decent wage from the beginning? Was it just that their case helped to make a broader case? Because you didn't just have a aged out of foster care working family tax credit, right? So how did that work out?
Well, I think when you look at the EITC in its original form, over the last 20, 30 years, I think politicians oftentimes make an assumption, right, that young people have the support of their parents. Maybe they're living at home while they go to college, and that's a very one-dimensional perspective, right? The reality is, a lot of young people, don't necessarily are able to live at home for those first few years they're out in the labor force. Oftentimes they're competing for those minimum wage jobs with established workers, right? Because we've sort of created a minimum wage economy, unfortunately, across the country. And so, for young people, I think the way they've been left out arbitrarily out of something that, quite frankly, is not going to break our bank, right? Because we still don't have that many young workers necessarily who would make use of this credit. But at the end of the day, for those who do get it, it is an important poverty alleviation measure. And for me, really, it's about equity, right? Making sure that we treat people the same without regard to these arbitrary prerequisites, whether it's young workers or folks without a social security number.
Yeah, well, on the age one, it does seem slightly odd to draw a line, somewhere in the mid-20s. It's not as if
right.
I have sons; they've all had to sign up for the draft once they turned 18. So it's weird where the lines get drawn, and so it does feel as if you're being treated as an adult in other ways by the state, it might be appropriate to do that. But in terms of the workers you talked about that can come in as a result of not having a social security number, where did the pressure for that come from? And do you have any sense of how many people that might bring in? So I'm asking both about the demand, like whether, the politics of that, I guess, how did that need become apparent? And then do you have any sense of what the numbers are likely to be? Presumably it's very difficult to know.
Yeah, it's difficult to know with certainty the actual number. I mean, we estimate anywhere between 30 and 40,000 people, families, because oftentimes you can get a family, and if one filer doesn't have the social security number, they don't qualify for the credit, even if one is a U.S. citizen with a social security number. So that makes the number a little bit bigger. But we estimate between 30 and 40,000 families will make use of it. Where the pressure comes from, I think really, again, as with the young workers example, it comes from the community. Immigrant women. And I said, congratulations, we increased the credit. And all of these women have young children at home. And they said, that's great, but we don't qualify for it, right? And I said, what do you mean? They said, we don't qualify for it. You have to have a social security number. And so, that kind of got me thinking about how do we make this credit accessible to those families? And really over the course of 2 years, a lot of public pressure to make it happen. And as we ended up passing this particular legislation with bipartisan support at the end of the day.
Yes, I didn't notice that, which is, I was going to my next question, actually. Javier, your internet, I think, dropped on us just for a little a moment there. So if it happens again, I might ask you just to turn your camera off and keep the audio, okay. But probably just a passing thing. But we did get everything you said, however, and just crack up a little bit of a loss there. Because I can imagine how, like, the earned income tax credit, in your case, the working family tax credit, can get bipartisan support in the sense that, in some ways, what we just heard the Senator and Angela talking about, which is, I'll be crude, liberals want to relieve poverty and conservatives like work. So here's the thing that promotes work and relieves poverty. But then when you extend it to then other groups, particularly perhaps the groups you're talking about, who don't have a social security number, my instinct would be that would make it harder to get bipartisan support. Was that your experience at all? How did the politics of that particular change play out?
Not this year. This year, that was not an issue. In fact, the issue with the original version of the bill was that we had some tax increases on the top earners in order to be able to pay for the expanded credit. That was the fight. Once we compromised that part of the bill, there was no commentary or opposition to these two groups of people receiving the credit. And that's a huge win for the community because as recently as 10 years ago, we've had politicians here running for office on anti-immigrant platforms, 100%, right? Much to my pleasant surprise, we did not hear that type of opposition on this issue. I think in our state, Republicans and Democrats both recognize that this particular tax credit, not only it's one of the most effective tax credits we have in our books from a return on investment perspective, but really it's a great poverty alleviation tool, right? It helps uplift families out of poverty and it rewards people working, right? Which is something that, folks who abide by the philosophy of, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and working hard for what you get. There's no better example than this credit, right? It rewards people who are working for their wages.
Yes, and you wonder, obviously there's two different things going on there. One is on the one hand, if we do have people in the country, documented or undocumented, better that they're working, right? And so you can attract support in the way that you just described in terms of the kind of politics of it. But I'm interested in who you think will benefit the most from some of these extensions in terms of age. So to come back again to the kind of age point, you've worked a lot. You're a community organizer by background, I think, right to say that. And so how do you think it will affect? I'm not suggesting for a moment that any tax policy, however amazing, can change the world. But can you play forward a little bit how you think that this change, how it might influence some of the young people kind of in the communities that you've got? You can probably think of particular people through your work and how that might play out in terms of their lives. What difference will it make at that level, do you think? Say if you're a 20-year-old, 21-year-old in a job who suddenly is going to get more help, what difference would it make to me if I'm that person?
Well, for a young worker without children, who's working for a living, the amount of the credit could help pay for a community college, for example. It could help pay for, for rent, which during the pandemic, rents have far exceeded what people are able to pay here in our state. There's a very practical benefit to it. I'm very intrigued by the idea, and Senator Bennet mentioned this, I'm very intrigued by the idea of this credit taking sort of a monthly installment approach to it, as opposed to a bulk sum at the beginning of the year or whatnot when you file taxes, because I think it helps people budget it differently. Now, from an advocacy and policy perspective, I think for the young people who made this happen in the state, you're talking about 20-year-old children aging out of foster care who played a key role in a major public policy shift in New Mexico. And that is almost unmeasurable, right? Imagine being that young person who testified in committee, who met with legislators, and who told their story and got what tends to be a pretty rigid legislative institution here in New Mexico to really change in its approach and come up with policies that those young people conceived, that they designed, that they came up with out of their own experience. So that's a tremendous, tremendous impact, both on the practical, but also on that aspirational side. We can't lose sight of that. I think that's an important win for them as well.
I think that's one of the things that's intriguing about the New Mexico story, the way you've just described it, is this sense of grassroots advocacy of young people themselves organizing around something as arcane and dull as tax credit reform. I mean, with not wishing to offend anybody else on this call, but everybody we're about to hear from, effectively, it's like, this is really dull stuff, right? And given all the other social issues that are around right now, given all the other issues that you would typically associate young people's activism with, right? At the risk of stereotyping, I think it would be fair to say that testifying in front of your taxation committee and getting into the details, which it is clear from looking at it that a lot of these young people became basically mini think tanks, right? Yes. Around this. How did you, any sense of how that happened? Was that your role? How do you get a bunch of young people to care so much about something so dull and yet so important?
You know, I cannot take credit at all for that. I mean, that we've got amazing organizations on the ground here in New Mexico, and we have philanthropic organizations that are investing in the leadership of young people across the state, people that are diverse in every sense, race, gender, ethnicity, geographic location, right? New Mexico's got this urban-rural divide as well, like we've seen in the rest of the country. Those of us in Albuquerque oftentimes don't get out to the rural communities much, and vice versa. So all the credit goes to them, to that organizing work that's happening in the community, and to the young people who put themselves in front of this. You know, you mentioned tax policy can be boring, and I agree. You know, when I came into the legislature, I didn't come to the legislature from a tax background. I'm a lawyer by training and an organizer by trade. And I kind of forced myself into the tax discussion because I realized that in order to improve the lives of people, yes, you need to do everything that, you know, generally we think about when it comes to social justice, but oftentimes people forget about the tax code as a source to achieve equity in this country. And I'm very proud that the tax justice movement in New Mexico has been led by young people, has been led by immigrants, has been led by single moms, has been led by working people. And I think that we can offer a great model, I think, for other states who wish to pursue more equitable tax policies in their tax code.
In some ways, of course, you know, the tax code is so powerful, so important that it's sort of politics at its kind of most powerful in some ways. And so to kind of avoid the political implications of tax reform is a huge mistake. I agree with you about that. We only have a couple of minutes left, and I'd just like to invite you to look forward now, given the achievement you've just made, obviously very, very early days, and you've described some of the things you hope you will see as a result of the changes you've just made. What's next on the agenda? Assuming this reform seems to be working well, and it right now seems to be quite likely to be interacting with complementary reforms at the federal level, what would be next on your agenda in terms of tax reform specifically, or more generally? And again, I really want you to focus on this group of young adults, right? Because we're very worried that, you know, you start poor and stay poor. How do we kind of create these ladders upwards? So what's on your next agenda?
You know, for me, there's a pre-COVID world and a post-COVID world. And what I saw during this pandemic is, to the extent that young people are working and stocking shelves and taking care of our elderly at nursing homes, so many of them are essential workers, and they've been on the front lines. What's next for us here is really broad-based tax reform with regard to our sales tax. And we can have a whole hour on this, but it's very regressive, right? And that's a place where Republicans and Democrats agree. We need to reform it because it's not working. Bigger picture, again, I want to explore the idea of these credits becoming monthly installments akin to a guaranteed basic income, right? This could be a source to provide people with a monthly income based on their, you know, tax bracket, based on qualifying for a tax credit of this sort that can help them pay for childcare, pay for their education, pay for their rent, and not force people into having to take that second or third job just to put food on the table. So I think that's what's coming next. And I think New Mexico, hopefully, will be at the forefront of that effort.
Well, it's very interesting you raise that, because the whole issue of monthly payments is one that has aroused some controversy, including among Michael Strain from AAI, who's on the panel that we're coming up to now. It's a feature rather than a bug, but it's not a feature. It's a feature that some people can take a different view on whether that's a good thing or not. But congratulations again on this recent success for you personally, and on your leadership in the community. Thank you for joining us, Javier.
Thank you, Richard. My pleasure.
Great. And with that, we're going to transition to the next stage of our agenda, which is a panel discussion I described as a galaxy of gurus before. And I will now say, having just said how boring tax policy can be, that if there is a group of economists and experts who can help us make tax policy much less boring, it is the group that you're about to hear from. My colleague Isabel Sawhill, Senior Fellow here at the Brookings Institution, will be moderating this discussion. She's the author most recently of Forgotten Americans. She's also the co-author with myself of a new contract with the middle class, and has been working in the Future of the Middle Class initiative here at the Brookings Institution with me for the last 3 or 4 years. And in a sense, this contract is a crowning achievement of that project. And Belle is a long-standing expert in tax reform generally, took a lead role in many of the tax credit debates in earlier years, and indeed strongly advocates a workers' tax credit in the contract I just mentioned, as well as in her own book. And so Belle's going to introduce our panel of experts on this question and then run the rest of our session. So Belle, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. What a fascinating discussion this has been.
Yeah.
And, now I am going to date myself and say that, as Richard indicated, my interest in this goes back to the Clinton years, when Clinton famously or infamously reformed welfare. He said welfare should be a way station and not a way of life, by which he meant temporarily being on welfare was fine, but more permanently, you should earn your living through work. And the other thing that he said that's less well known is he said, if you work, you should not be poor. That was a phrase he picked up from David Ellwood, who was also in our administration. And we indeed made one of the early and biggest jumps in expanding the earned income tax credit for exactly that reason, because the president wanted to be able to say, if you worked, you wouldn't be poor. So with that as background, we now have a new expansion of the EITC to childless workers. And just as a reminder for our audience, or a help to our audience, my colleague Morgan Welsh has put together a nice slide that shows what the EITC looks like right now and what changes the current American Rescue Package is proposing. This is just to help all of us, since these tax policies are, as Richard just said, extraordinarily complex, very hard to remember what the current rules are, much less what the changes that are being proposed are. So this is just to give us a little help here. With that, I am really delighted to welcome this panel. This is a group of people that I overwhelmingly respect for the work that they've done on this set of issues. And I'm just really pleased they could join us today. I'm not going to go through their very impressive and extensive backgrounds or resumes. I'll just very quickly introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. And then they're each going to speak very briefly. And after that, we will open it up for Q&A amongst ourselves and with the larger audience. So with us, we have Christopher Farrisee. Chris, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, so I apologize if I'm not. He is a professor of political science at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. Welcome, Chris. We then have Elaine Magg. Elaine's work on the child tax credit and the EITC and so forth have been a huge influence on my own thinking about this. And she is at the Urban Institute, which along with Brookings, is responsible for something we call the Tax Policy Center, and they have done all of the great work on what we know about the distributional aspects and also the costs of various tax credits and changes in them. We then have Diane Schazenbach, and Diane has also been at Brookings and is a huge well-known name in all of the research on what's happening to children in America. She is currently the director of the Institute for Policy Research at Northwestern University. And Diane, it's fabulous to have you. And last but definitely not least is my friend Michael Strain from AEI. And I should have said right from the beginning, or we all should have said, we're really, really pleased that we are co-sponsoring this event with AEI and have people like Michael and Angela with us. So with that, let me turn it over and start with you, Chris, on any opening thoughts on these reforms to the EITC.
Well, thank you so much, Isabel, for having me. And thank you, Richard, also for the invitation and for Brookings. I'm really excited to be on the panel and hear what the panelists have to say about the future of the EITC. So we heard from Senator Bennet and from Representative Martinez about why the EITC is popular among policymakers. I'm going to talk a little bit in my time here about why it's popular with voters. So recently I conducted a nationwide study along with my co-author Chris Ellis on public opinion towards federal tax expenditures, including the EITC. And one thing to note, and by the way, this is in a book if you're interested, called The Other Side of the Coin. And the EITC is widely popular. It enjoys majority support from the American public. And I think importantly for this discussion, it enjoys support among groups that normally are antagonistic towards government spending. So we found that it enjoys plurality support among conservatives, among people with low trust in government, and people who score high in racial animosity. So those groups' support of the EITC along with Democrats helps kind of buoy this program to be widely popular among the American public. In addition, we ran survey experiments where we presented respondents in our national survey a description of the EITC without naming it. And then we asked them to qualify how deserving the recipient was of benefits. And what we found is that people find the recipients of the EITC deserving, if for nothing else, of the basic description of the program. And they're able to deduct that this is a benefit that goes towards workers and taxpayers, and people's perception of recipients as workers and taxpayers are the biggest factors into why they favor some government programs over others. So any efforts to scale back the EITC are going to face the headwinds of public opinion. I would also say that the changing electoral party coalitions among Democrats and Republicans might protect the EITC going forward. Since 1992, working class whites have left the Democratic Party in large numbers and voted more for the Republican Party. And now you have working class constituencies both within the Democratic and Republican Party. So you have beneficiaries of this new expanded tax credit in the Republican camp and the Democratic camp. And the last thing I'd say was a point that was mentioned by Senator Bennet, and that is the importance of the EITC for democracy. Wages for low-income workers, as we know, have been stagnant for decades. And what we're seeing in national public opinion polls are more and more citizens don't feel invested in the nation's economy. And if citizens don't feel invested in the economy, if a rising tide does not lift all boats, they are more likely to turn to conspiracy theories to explain their economic insecurity, and more likely to be attracted to candidates who promise
wildly and extreme policy positions that promise more money for them in a period of economic distress. So there really needs to be an effort to retether the American worker to the performance of the nation economy, not only for the sake of these households, but also for democracy itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I'm so glad you made the connection to democracy and to our politics, especially to where it's been headed in recent years. Elaine, over to you.
Thanks. I also want to extend my thanks to you and Richard for hosting. This is exciting. What I thought I would do is put a little bit of that first slide you showed into context of what those changes mean, and a little bit of what I think needs to happen next stage. The first is, I think it's pretty clear that the childless part of the EITC has always been somewhat of an afterthought. It's sort of wedged into this credit that is a really powerful tool for low and middle income families with children. And in fact, it wasn't until the program had been running for 20 years that we even gave any credit at all to workers who are childless on their tax returns. And interestingly enough, there's been a string of proposals, and they were coming from both the left and right, perhaps most famously from Representative Ryan and President Obama, to expand this piece of the credit. And despite near identical proposals, it didn't get enacted. And so then the next opportunity came along in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. We have this big tax reform happening, and surely this is the moment when this credit will get expanded, and it doesn't, which is a little bit of a surprise. And so I think I was, despite everything Chris is saying about how popular it was, almost surprised that it again popped its head up in the American Rescue Plan. And I think the changes were important, but I think it still should be thought of as a support for families with children. And here's why. It used to be that about 25% of all claimants of the EITC were childless workers, but they got just 3% of the benefits. So a really small slice of the total. And now those numbers have changed. So childless workers will be about 45% of the claimants, and they're going to get about 17% of the benefits. So it's still a small amount of pie is going to this group of people, though it is more balanced. I think the expansion is really interesting at this moment because it was almost made for this moment. I did work with Laura Wheaton and Kevin Warner, where we modeled a very similar expansion of the childless EITC. And the top 3 industries of workers that would benefit are those in retail, accommodations, and healthcare. And those, of course, are the industries that have been slammed in this pandemic. So it was a good policy for this moment. The one oversight in the legislation that I think is worth bringing up is that a lot of independent students will be left out of the credit. So it's widely available if you're 19 now instead of age 25. But if you're a student, even if you're only in school half-time for 5 months of the year, you're excluded from this expansion. And I think that's short-sighted, and it doesn't really ground with what we know. So there's a lot of low-income people attending college right now. About half of students are actually working. It's generally recognized that for low-income people, the benefit formula for getting your college age both overstates how much money people have to pay for college and understates the needs of a lot of young students. Half of students are getting by on incomes that are less than twice poverty, so they're pretty low income. And lack of money is the number one reason they're saying they're leaving college. And so my thought is, if you're independent and you're going to school and you're working, why not get the boost? Leaving struggling students out introduces sort of, in my mind, needless complexity. It's hard for the IRS to administer this provision anyway, and adding additional rules that they don't get data on is not going to help it. The final comment I'll make is that there are important links between federal and state EITCs, and when the federal EITC increases, we know that 28 states plus the District of Columbia will automatically see their EITCs increase as well. So there are state implications that are pretty important to this policy as well.
Thank you, Elaine. Diane, over to you.
Thank you, and it's great to be here with you. So I wanted to briefly start with sort of a lap around all the great things that we've learned about the earned income tax credit. Of course, Michael Strain and I have a recent paper that documents that the expansions of the earned income tax credit have really increased employment, especially among single mothers. And then there are all these spillovers on a range of other outcomes. Children are born healthier. They're more likely, their test scores go up. They're more likely to go to college. There's just this range of really good outcomes. And so, of course, now we're talking about expanding this for childless adults. And a question is, will we see similar impacts? Now, fortunately, MDRC recently did a randomized trial of what's called Paycheck Plus, which is sort of targeted after what it would look like to have a large EITC expansion for childless individuals. And the results, I would say, were quite impressive. They reduced severe poverty, and so therefore I would expect this EITC expansion to do the same. It expanded employment rates, and really primarily did those after a year, and sort of was aided when people really understood what this extra payment would do for them if they were employed. Something that was surprising to me is that those employment rates went up the most among childless women, and then also the most disadvantaged men. And so this expansion is a policy that's really going to reach some of the most disadvantaged workers that we have. Another important finding from the Paycheck Plus work is that more child support was paid, because these non-custodial parents had more resources. So I think there's a lot to be excited about here, and as we're experiencing a lot of shifts in our social safety net, with the big expanded child tax credit, which I hope they will make permanent. I do think that there's, it's maybe worth having some, broader thought conversations about, how much should we be tying our pro-work incentives to the presence of children in your house? And I think most economists would say, we've bundled those two together too much, and it might actually make sense to, provide more assistance for children through a different program, and then turn our employment incentivizing work, potentially even, regardless of whether one has kids. Thanks.
Terrific. And I want to commend all of you for being brief and concise and interesting at the same time, which is always hard. Michael.
Well, I will continue the tradition of being brief. Thank you, Bill. One of the advantages of going last is that you can comment on what everybody has said before you. And I agree with basically everything that has been said. I think all these points are correct, valid, and important.
There's always
we should, I think,
after that.
I'm sorry. No, there's no but. I have
no but that comes after.
I have no but. I think we should expect to see this tripling, really, of the EITC for childless workers to pull people into the workforce. And the reason why it would do that is very straightforward. It increases the financial rewards from working, and so some people who are on the margin between working and not working will join the workforce as a consequence of it being a better deal for them. There's been some dispute about whether or not we should expect the EITC actually to increase employment. I would direct anybody who's interested in that debate to read the paper I wrote with Diane. I think we do a pretty convincing job of demonstrating that we should expect the EITC to increase employment. Though of course that's for other people to judge and not me. I think this should be a bipartisan policy. And one of the great disappointments I had with the 2017 tax law was that it didn't do this. It didn't expand the earned income tax credit for childless workers, and I think we should commend President Biden and the Congress for including it in the American Rescue Plan. This should appeal to a Republicans' sense that personal responsibility is important, that work is important, and that the role of government policy isn't to give handouts, but is instead to give a hand up. And that's exactly what the EITC does. You only get it if you're working, and it goes to low-income workers to help them make ends meet, to help make work more attractive, with the idea that when you get your foot on the rung of the first rung of the employment ladder, then it's much easier to pull yourself up. And the real hurdle might be actually getting on that ladder in the first place. It should appeal to Democrats because it is one of the most effective anti-poverty policies that the United States has come up with. And so hopefully there will be a robust and significant bipartisan coalition for making this permanent, because the AARP did this for 1 year, and 1 year is better than no years. But if we really want to see the positive effects of this program, then we want to make this a part of permanent law. And, I hope that the policy community can turn its attention to helping to inform and achieve that objective.
Thank you. Let me ask all of you one simple question. Are any of you against making this particular temporary provision permanent? Okay. Let me ask another question that's come up from people watching the event and came up a little bit earlier. And that is the whole idea of a universal basic income. And some people have said, oh, well, this is the camel's nose under the tent. This is an opening salvo in getting some kind of a guaranteed income for everyone, because as the senator said, we've had a lot of growth, but it hasn't been very broadly distributed, and we're a wealthy country. And doesn't everybody need a minimum of, take your pick, $10,000 a year? Andrew Yang is running for mayor of New York now, and he's gotten a lot of attention for this set of ideas when he was running for president. Does any of you see this as just a first step toward something like a UBI, a universal basic income?
I'm hoping it's a step away from a universal basic income. We have a challenge in the United States, which is that a large portion of our workforce can only command wages in the labor market that we think of as low. And one solution to that is UBI, which is to say, well, those lower wage jobs are bad jobs. People shouldn't work in those jobs. We don't need those jobs, and let's extend everybody a universal basic income so they can finance their lives without having to work. I think the EITC has the exact opposite answer to that problem. The EITC says, okay, well, if we're going to have people who are only able to command low wages and therefore household income is low, and let's subsidize their earnings, and let's make sure they're still working, because work is important. Work is important for society. Work is important, an important source of dignity for individuals. Work is much more than just the size of a paycheck. But of course, the size of the paycheck matters. And so we will have a societal covenant that if you work full time and head a household, you won't live in poverty. And if what you can pull in from the labor market is, 20, 25, 30 grand a year or something like that, then society has a responsibility to subsidize your earnings, provided that you are working. And so, I strongly support the underlying vision that the EITC advances of society. And one way to characterize that is in direct contrast to the underlying societal vision that UBI puts forward, which I think would be bad for many, many reasons.
Well, I like that argument. Does anybody on this panel have any sort of major as opposed to minor disagreement with it?
Oh,
I think I'd like to weigh in. Oh,
sure.
All right.
Go ahead, Diane.
okay, and then we'll turn it over to Chris. I do think that sort of our best employment promoting strategy is to provide more incentives to work, and that means an expanded earned income tax credit, a robustly growing economy. One little caveat that I would add is that over the last 25 years, we've shifted so much to trying to incentivize work that we've discovered during recessions, this pandemic and previous recession, that workers are underinsured when they lose their jobs. And so I just would want to sort of weigh in with that one little sort of nit that this is a policy that works well, especially when the economy is growing, and we all want to see the economy growing quickly again soon. It's growing now, but we need to know that we can't just put all of our eggs in that basket, and we need to make sure to have out of work supports available, whatever those look like.
Chris, did you want to come in on this particular issue, or not necessarily?
Sure. No. Yeah. So I think the EITC expansion is a start, but it's just a start for restructuring the economy so it works for everyone. I have students who are coming out with college debt. They're having a hard time buying a home. They're looking at the expense of having a child, right? And unless there are changes to the economy that not only makes it work for low income workers, but for middle income workers too, then I think there will be growing support for a UBI. I don't think the EITC with this 1-year expansion will do it, but what was mentioned by Representative Martinez with the child tax credit expansion, if you think about a person's bank statement, right? They open it up to check it. And if they have 2 working incomes, they get 4 green numbers a month and then a whole sea of black numbers. All of a sudden now, if they have children, they're going to get a green number in there that says IRS or US Treasury, right? So then there might be a question, well, why can't we deliver benefits this way?
Well, actually, glad you brought that up, because it occurs.
It's a good argument against doing a monthly child allowance.
Yeah, what I was going to say is, if you have 3 children, you are getting the equivalent of a $10,000 UBI. So it's a UBI for families with children who have incomes under, say, $150,000 a year. If the CTC, if the child tax credit is made permanent along with this expansion of the EITC, we are basically back in the arena of a semi UBI. But leave that there for the moment, because I want to go back to an issue that Elaine brought up and get her back in the conversation. And Elaine, I thought what you said about students was interesting. And I think when we talk about expanding the age eligibility down to 19, people do think immediately about people who are in college. And I guess the current provision says, unless you are in close to full time or more than half time in school, you can get it. But if you are more than half time in school, you can't, right? And you're saying, why shouldn't it just be whether you're independent or not? But how do we do a good job of measuring whether somebody is economically independent from their parents or not? That's a genuine question.
So I think the bigger question is, are we willing to be afraid of the, improper claim by a high income kid who's in college, but we haven't, attached them to their parents' tax return at the expense of the low income kid who's really struggling to get through school and working. And so that, to me, is where you make the value call of whether you include students. And then, does the IRS do a good job of administering the provision and dependency? It's not clear to me. They don't have all of the information they need reported on information returns. So that sort of slots it into the group of provisions that the IRS is not as good at administering. We do have financial aid records for a lot of people that indicate whether their parents are contributing to their finances, which gives you some sense of kids who should qualify because they are supporting themselves.
Okay. I want to go back to the question of the marriage penalty that came up in the conversation with Senator Bennet, and whether or, some of our friends and colleagues often raise this issue of marriage penalties, and if you are in favor of bringing back two-parent married families, you worry about this. As the senator said, it's very complicated because under current law, there can be marriage penalties, but also marriage bonuses. Is anybody worried about this? Would your answer be very similar to what the senator's was, which is we don't think it's going to affect behavior, so let's not worry about it? And fixing it is very expensive, or does anybody have another view of that?
I do think that there's not a lot of evidence that marriage tax penalties, especially at this part of the distribution, are sort of a serious impediment to marriage formation. I think if we want to, take a serious swipe at that issue, we should do it more systematically throughout the tax system. But sort of flagging it for just this very modest amount of money for childless workers doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It doesn't even seem like it's hard to imagine that will be a big barrier.
Right.
Also, I have an issue with the framing. I mean, we could call it a marriage penalty, or we can call it a recognition that we have a household-based tax system. If imagine a kind of cartoonish example where one person earns $100,000 a year and his spouse doesn't work, and then the spouse goes and gets a job for one afternoon a week or something like that, and then the spouse gets the EITC. I mean, that doesn't make much sense either. And so I think we have a household-based tax system. There are good reasons for that, and as long as we have one, then I'm not sure why we think of this in terms of as a penalty rather than just a recognition of the reality that people who live in the same household can pool resources.
Okay. So let me now bring up another issue, which Diane, you very much alluded to this, and that is here we have 3 temporary tax credits that are in the new bill, rescue bill. One is child tax credit, one is the earned income tax credit, and the third is the child and dependent care tax credit, which is also expanded to a much more generous level and will also help low-income families and middle-income families who are earning a living and have child care expenses that they must undertake for that reason. Now, it occurs to me, and I'm sure it's occurred to a number of you as well, Elaine, I think you in particular may have written about this, that this is getting pretty complicated to have 3 different basic tax credits that overlap in what they intend to achieve and who they serve. The earned income tax credit is really focused on work, rewarding people who work, although it also helps to reduce poverty. The child tax credit is really focused on children and not so much on poverty because it goes way up the income scale. As someone said earlier, it actually helps 90% of all American families, all of them except those at the very top. And we have not wanted to rein it in from there. I think we can all agree that making the existing child tax credit fully refundable at the bottom is a good thing to do. But if you spend enough money on a child tax credit all the way up the income scale, you're going to get big reductions in after-tax income, and that's a different goal. And then finally, there's this issue of simply what's the best way to reduce poverty at the very bottom. So work, poverty reduction, and helping children, and complexity. Can you imagine, or is it just politically infeasible to completely imagine these tax credits in a way that would achieve some balance of these goals, but without some family having to figure out 3 different tax credits with 3 different sets of eligibility criteria, 3 different sets of benefits, et cetera, 3 different application processes. Anybody worried about that? Especially if we're going to make these things permanent.
So I do worry about the complexity a lot. The child care credit, first of all, goes to very few families, and it's not going to go to that many more families, even in its new incarnation, because very low income families, as you know, don't have child care expenses that they can wait a year to get reimbursed for. So they tend to rely on informal care or.
But the law makes it refundable, Elaine.
Right, but it still doesn't come at the right time. And when we model the credit, we just don't see that huge of benefits to very low income families just because they don't have the expenses there. And they get, other subsidies that are much more efficient. We should, in my view, move to separating these work and child credits out. I think you've proposed the same thing. It makes it so people know what the incentive is for, what does the tax system want them to do. And, if we had a uniform definition of child and one child benefit, then people would understand it and hopefully react to it in better ways. Interestingly, the expansion of the EITC, in my view, to childless folks actually makes that transition easier because you can pull out more of the EITC that goes to everyone now and call that your worker credit. And then you have less left over in the piece that only families with children get of the EITC to figure out how to merge that into the child tax credit.
Elaine, more thoughts on that? I mean, sorry, Diane, more thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was going to agree with a lot of those points, and I think as we're thinking about making the child tax credit permanent and maybe switching to sort of some sort of a basic income for children and then a worker credit, I think that makes a lot of sense. But of course, we can't make any of these changes until we know what's permanent and what's not permanent. And so a concern that I've got is that maybe that we'll not make some of these things permanent, even though I think they'll be good. But then if we respond by changing other policies too quickly, we might be back in a situation where there's not enough support for children, especially for out of work parents.
Okay, let's move for a moment. We're waiting, by the way, for Speaker Ryan to join us, and I'm going to let me see if I'm getting any message whether he's come or not. Oh, good, he is here. All right. I am therefore going to close this off so we can hear from him. And I really, really want to thank all of you for taking the time to do this. It was a great discussion, and look forward to more conversation about all of this. Okay, let me then say that we're really honored today. I am especially honored to get to introduce the former Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. And he has left, as we all know, public service, but he's still very active, and pleased to note that he hasn't given up some of his intellectual energy. He's spending it now partly at AEI and partly as a professor at Notre Dame. And he's doing many other things as well, but I just wanted to tick off the fact that as someone who's always been a kind of a guru on policy, especially policy to improve opportunity and reduce poverty, and policies to rein in fiscal deficits and other things that I care about, I've always been a fan of his intellect. And I also have a warm spot for him in my heart, because although he and I disagree on an awful lot, I've always appreciated the fact that he's willing to have a discussion with almost anyone about almost anything. So with that, Speaker Ryan, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. And I should have mentioned, most important thing of all, he has been a major advocate for extending the EITC to childless workers. And I think he's the one we have to thank amongst a number of others for keeping this issue alive. And it must be gratifying to him to see it now, hopefully coming to fruition. So over to you.
Hey, great. Belle, it's nice to see you again. It's been a little while. I enjoy my times over at Brookings, and I used to call Alice my Jewish mother. So I'm going to need a new mom at Brookings. So I think I just adopted you.
I'm eligible by age.
All right. Awesome. So it's really nice to see you again. I'll tack on. So I unfortunately didn't get to participate in the earlier parts of this. So I'll just give a few thoughts on EITC and some policy fights that may be in the future. But thank you very much for that introduction. I still spend a good deal of time on this. I see a lot of familiar faces on this. I think personally, if you just ask me, I spent a lot of time in this space when I was in government. I do now. If you had to ask me what is the one thing that government does that's the most effective at fighting poverty, I would say it is the EITC. Just no two ways about it. If I had to pick one strategy, one thing, I think it's the most effective poverty tool we have. It accomplishes its intended effect, and it does so without reducing labor force participation. So I've always spent my time on EITC. The American Recovery Plan did three things, if I'm off the top of my head here. It tripled the maximum credit up to $1,500, I think. It reduced the minimum age down to 29 from 25 to 19, and it increased the amount of childless adults by doubling the phase in and the phase out ranges. All three of those are things that I was pushing for back when I was budget chairman in 2014. So sometimes it takes a while for policies to actually occur. This is one of those things that I think has had a long bipartisan appeal, and I'm glad that this has happened. So having said that, when we propose these things, we always had pay-fors. So we always found ways of creating fiscal space to pay for it. This is temporary. It was done in emergency legislation. So I think we're gonna have a pretty good debate about whether this gets extended or not. I think it's good policy, therefore I think it should. But I do think we have to be mindful of our fiscal situation. And there are less important things that could be cut to pay for this. So I do believe that we're gonna have to have a pretty good conversation about how to pay for the extension of these policies when we go from emergency relief and we take into account our debt and our deficits, which are coming back with a vengeance. They have come back with a vengeance, and how we make these things permanent. A couple other points, I guess I'd say, Belle, and that is there's a bit of a debate on our side of the transom on family policy versus labor. And I see this as actually a good debate. I have opinions about the debate, but I would basically say the hot topic in conservative circles these days is we have a number of competing proposals, some of which make more sense and some that make less sense in my own opinion. But at the core of these proposals, there's a perceived conflict. And there's this belief that, support for families and family formation comes at odds with policies that promote labor force participation. You've got conservative work around welfare that Ron Haskins and I and many people back in the day worked on this in the 90s and in the 2000s. And we really spent a lot of our time working at promoting labor force participation. The EITC is a labor force promoter. The idea from our side of the aisle came from Uncle Milton Friedman, who proposed the negative income tax. So there's a long history on our side of promoting labor force participation and the tools like the EITC that do that. But we've got some new proposals from folks who I would say they're not hostile to labor force participation, but they just want to focus on family formation. And Senator Romney, a very close personal friend of mine, has a child allowance. Child allowances more broadly. There are a number of people who are pushing these. They would help support families with kids. On the positive side, they would reduce poverty by a lot. But it's also possible that they could have negative effects on labor force participation, I think. So my one concern in this is we're being forced in this debate of choosing. And if we look at child allowances, My concern, if we do this federally across the board, that's a pretty new program. We're not sure of all the effects of this. I would much rather see a state take the lead and play with a child allowance and beta test that and see what the drawbacks are. What are the unintended consequences? Does it actually reduce labor force participation? Because I think this is something that you just wouldn't want to put nationwide right away. Frankly, I think there are some other tools that are already in place that kind of give us what we need. The CTC, the child tax credit, it's been around for a long time. I expanded it when I was, writing tax law. It's refundable now. It just got expanded in this last emergency bill and the EITC. So frankly, I think we're better off in this battle of ideas, and it's a good thing to have with what we know. And with what we know kind of works, and then figuring out ways of finding the fiscal space to pay for those things. So I think it's sort of preferable to work with the child tax credit, the EITC, because we have a pretty good understanding of their effects. And I think if we're going to spend money in this area, that's where we should be looking first. I don't think the overall goals between family stability and labor force participation need to be in tension. I think one of the things that we can look at is ways of reducing marriage penalties in the EITC. A lot of people on our side of the aisle are looking at just doing that, building on the current program, and we generally know the effects of it. The one thing that I would say that bothered me a lot when I was in government, and I just kept having these arguments with Treasury people, is I really think the EITC should be basically embedded in the paycheck. It should be monthly. You should see it on top of your wage every time you receive your wage, not at the end of the year. And it got to the point where the antiquated systems at Treasury just could not do this. So it got to the point where we looked at just converting it over to a Social Security program through the W-2 system, because those systems can do a monthly benefit. And we ended up not doing it because you basically have to end the EITC and add Social Security, and that just was too big of a hill to climb. So my hope is that policymakers, and more importantly, technologists, can finally figure this out. There is a decent amount of fraud. I think the last score I saw when I ran it by Joint Tax and CBO on fraud in EITC was about a $26 billion price tag. I'm sure that number is much higher. That's what I wanted to use, using, requiring things like Social Security numbers and tax ID numbers. Little small things that honestly I don't think should be controversial, that bring program integrity to the EITC, are good ways to getting the fiscal space to pay for these expansions that I think are worthy. But we've got to get technologists to figure out how to fix the darn systems that our government has, so we can actually have better tools, so we can embed the EITC inside the paycheck at the pay period, so that you really do see that work does pay every time you do it. So I think there are things like that are really important reforms, that there's really no reason why we shouldn't have these things, other than ridiculous technology excuses, in my opinion. With that, I'll say I'm excited about the energy in this space. I'm excited Mitt Romney has a proposal on child formation, on child allowances. Marco Rubio plays a lot in this space, Tim Scott. So I'm talking about people on our side of the aisle. What I see is we've got finally conservatives and a decent critical mass who are putting out interesting, innovative proposals to reduce poverty. And we're going to end up in a much better place for policymaking, because policymakers trend to go toward where the action is. And if we're spending a lot of intellectual capital here, we're going to see a lot of political capital following. So frankly, when you're speaker, you're basically running, a crazy place, and you're spending all your time on things that are not policy. I've really enjoyed these last 2 years focusing more on discrete policy things. And I do see, and this is my think tank pitch, I do see a shortage of connective tissue between Capitol Hill legislators and think tanks, between Democrats in Brookings and Republicans in AEI, and Republicans in Brookings and Democrats at AEI or Heritage or whoever. When I started in politics, there was not a day where I was not over at one of these think tanks, Brookings included, or one of these people were in our office giving us feedback, giving us ideas, helping us prepare solutions and ideas. There is so much less of that these days. So one of the things that I want to do in my post, elected career is start reconnecting this tissue. so that these people, these bright ideas, you just had Schanzenbach on, I saw, I want to get these bright people connecting with policymakers who just, didn't come up in the 80s and the 90s when the think tanks were the thing. They're getting so besieged by new media, by all these platforms, these digital platforms, that they don't think about think tanks, they don't have time for it. So I think there's some reconnective tissue that has to occur. There are some policy leaders spending their time in this space. So I'm actually pretty optimistic that we're going to crack the code on some of these things. We've got new tools, we have new data, new analytics, and new technologies that I really think are going to help us hone these skills that economists have been dreaming about for years, that will really move the needle on poverty and not make us have to make these choices between laudable goals like family support and labor force participation. So that's my 2 cents to it. They told me to go for about 10 minutes. That's what I just try to do. I'm a House person, so I stick to my allotted time. I'm not a senator. I don't go off way past my allotted time. So that's my piece, Belle.
I think it was terrific. And I loved the way you talked about the sort of growing tension or alleged tension between family policy and work or labor policy. I have seen that tension as well, and have wondered if the thing that's sort of glossing over or papering over that tension right now is the fact that we're spending a lot of money.
Yes.
And we're spending a lot of money because we're in a pandemic and in a recession. And when you're spending $2 trillion or whatever, it's not hard to achieve multiple goals. But if you get into the world where we're trying to make these policies permanent, and we're spending this much money every single year, not just on a one-time basis, and not just as part of an emergency, then the whole issue of pay-fors is going to come up, and as is the issue of trade-offs between, are we going to do this policy or that policy? Where are our priorities? So I think those tensions are going to come back into play, and also the issues that you've spent so much of your life working on, which are the fiscal issues, are going to come back into play. Do you want to say anything about your sort of future guesses about where a second and more permanent package might be going, and how in the world we are going to pay for it, and whether there's any room for bipartisanship in that context?
Well, I don't want to pan the Biden infrastructure pan. I could, but there's no point of that right now in this thing. I think they picked the wrong tax policy. I obviously, as the person who co-authored the current tax code, I don't like what they're doing, the business taxation. I think it's going to lower growth, lower wages, create inversions. I think on that, they should, I believe in user fees for infrastructure. I think they'd be better off, first of all, if they scoop up these pay-fors, if they actually pass this, which I think is questionable, then that's going to this infrastructure spending. It's not going to go for these other things. So why don't we do an infrastructure bill with user fees? And frankly, gas taxes are losing revenue source. It's a bad model with mileage standards and electric vehicles. So go to a VMT. I can tell you, if you just did an infrastructure package and you went to a vehicle miles traveled, you'll get 50 or 60 Republicans. So, and it won't be a $2 trillion bill, but you'll have a substantial package. I know you can get the votes for that. So the reason I mentioned this, Belle, is because let's take this current debate and scale its spending down to actual infrastructure and make it a user fee system and do some asset recycling and have a nice infrastructure package, which truly could be bipartisan. Then when we're dealing with pay-fors on these expiring provisions that came in with an emergency, there at least is a space for debate on how to pay for those things. Because right now, if you're gonna stand on the Hill right now for new spending, and you're gonna take what I think the other side of the aisle thinks are the best pay-fors, we don't think that's true. You're not gonna have any room for this stuff. So I would argue infrastructure with user fee. I think base broadening is better. I thought SALT reduction or elimination was a smart policy. That's why we put it in the tax code in the first place. I want to get rid of it completely. I didn't have the votes. So I raised it to 10,000, passed it. If they repeal that, then you're really far backwards. So look, I also still believe in the border adjustment that Kevin Brady and I were pushing around. Now we got killed by the consumer sector, by big box retailers and the senators from those big box retailer states, basically Georgia and Arkansas, and a few in between. But at the end of the day, we have a pretty good tax system right now. It's very competitive. If they take this current tax system and increase this global minimum tax, it's just going to hurt us. I think at the end of the day, and I don't see that happening this session, it's the majorities are just too narrow. I think a tax base like what Kevin Brady and I try to do with the border adjustment tax, which is basically a subtraction method VAT with wages as deductible, because you want to prefer wages, you want to be pro-labor. I think WTO will take it. I don't buy this argument that they won't. I think exchange rates wash this stuff out, and I think it's a far, far smarter, better revenue system for a country that can do a better job of raising revenue for things that we think are important without doing damage to our economy and without slowing down labor force participation or making American businesses less competitive. So that's a big macro statement, I guess I'd say. In the meantime, I think there's a lot of program integrity in these programs that you can get at to save money to extend these policies. And the last point I guess I'd say is more data and analytics, the programmability of money, which is coming. We will have, I assume and hope, a digital dollar eventually. We're going to be able to program money more intelligently. I spend time now on crypto and digital currency issues. So it's just technology, blockchain, I've been just enamored with. I believe this technology, permission ledgers and the rest, is going to give us the ability to do a lot of program, meaning clean out waste and fraud and target exactly to whom and for what we want to target for. This isn't Big Brother. This is just making sure the spending that we do goes to the place we want it to go for the things we want it to go to. And I really, really believe there's a tremendous amount of savings that can be done there. And using data analytics and good microeconomics, we can actually, move people out of poverty, make a big difference, and do it cheaper than we're doing it right now. So these things I think are going to take a while to do, but that to me is the exciting future of poverty policy in America today, with a better understanding of economics and technology and the fusion of those things in our government.
Great. Well, I think that I'm being told that our time is coming to an end. But
okay, I sounded like a senator then there. Sorry about that.
We got this bonus statement from you on these bigger macro questions and questions that are really going to loom large and are going to affect actually the prospects for the EITC and other anti-poverty programs. So thank you for that. But most of all, thank you so much for taking the time to do this today. I am so glad that you still think think tanks are relevant and that you think we can all work together and have more conversation back and forth between those of us who are interested in intellectual issues and policy and helping improve people's lives, and those of us who are in a position to actually make it happen. So thank you again, and thank you everyone for joining us today on behalf of Brookings and AEI and all of my colleagues in both organizations who helped to put this together.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.